This week we'll be talking about two key areas, warm-up and flexibility. These two areas, though, have often been linked, but it's important to differentiate between the two as they have distinctly different key functions for the athlete. A warm-up is an integral part of any training session or competition. It's very important for all athletes to warm up before practice and competition. The reason why we want athletes to warm up is because athletes who are looking to improve their sports performance or lengthen their athletic careers by modifying the risk of injury can focus on the warm-up and also flexibility. Not only does a warm-up have a factor on warm-up and flexibility, but it can also mentally and physically prepare athletes by increasing the temperature of muscles, increasing the core temperature, increasing the blood flow to the active muscles that are being warmed up, provide a faster contraction and relaxation of muscles. It can also improve the rate of force development, improve reaction time, increase or improve muscular strength and power, and also increases the oxygen delivery to the muscles. Not only does a warm-up prepare an athlete physically, but it can also prepare the athlete mentally by setting some sort of tone for the upcoming activity and establish a desired tempo. So by doing so, this can get the athlete kind of the mindset of going into the actual competition and the cadence for that competition as well. But whenever we are creating a warm-up, a well-designed warm-up for an athlete, it should be obviously individualized based on the athlete's needs, the goals, and the athlete's ability on performing certain exercises during this warm-up. But the warm-up activities are necessary to help prepare the body for vigorous physical activity and all the benefits it includes, just as I mentioned in the previous slide. But it also increases performance and decreases the risk of muscular injury. Not only does a well-designed warm-up enhance the athletic performance and reduce the risk of injury, it can also lessen the potential for muscle soreness after exercise. And this is often referred to as DOMS, so delayed onset muscle soreness. And with DOMS, this can last or can start having an effect on an athlete or any individuals with novel exercise or anything or some sort of activity, starting within 24 hours and lasting up to 96 hours. But when we think of this whole warm-up procedure, often we incorporate two different things such as stretching and warming up. But we have to know that these are two distinct activities. The warm-up consists of preparatory activities and functionally based movements that are specifically designed to prepare the body for exercise or sport, while stretching enhances flexibility. Now, when we incorporate warm-up and flexibility into the athlete's programming, we have to know that there are different types of stretching, which we'll talk a little bit later in this PowerPoint presentation. But by incorporating both of these, we can essentially improve the athlete's performance and help modify their risk injury. It is generally advised that a warm-up consists of some sort of period of aerobic exercise, followed by stretching, and then ending the period with an activity similar to the upcoming competition or activity. Usually, a traditional warm-up program structure is built around some sort of key requirements and typically involves two different phases. The first is the general warm-up phase or period, which consists of about 5 to 10 slow to moderate intensity cardiorespiratory exercise, which is usually whole body, such as jogging or cycling. The aim of this phase is to increase heart rate, increase the blood flow, increase deep muscle temperature, increase the respiration rate and perspiration, and decrease viscosity of the joint fluids. Also, during this phase, this is typically followed by a period of general stretching, and more specifically static stretching when we think of the traditional way, which pretty much aims to replicate the ranges of motion required for the upcoming activity. And during static stretching, this is holding some sort of stretch or position for 10 to 30 seconds, all depending on how long you want the athlete or you are prescribing for that certain stretch. But when we think of stretching, we want a total time of 60 seconds, right? And with stretching, depending on what you're doing for that athlete or the upcoming activity, this can last also several minutes. Following the general warm-up and the static stretching, there's a specific warm-up period which incorporates movements similar to the movements of the athlete's sport. This phase should also include some sort of rehearsal of the skills that are going to be performed. Not only that, is during this specific warm-up, we're slowly increasing the intensity based off the general warm-up. Not only that, this allows the body to adjust to the changing physiological demands. When we look at the warm-up period, there are different ways to kind of warm up the individual's or the athlete's body. We just talked about the general warm-up and specific warm-up, so this would be referred to as an active warm-up, which consists of low-intensity movements, warming the tissue and producing a variety of improvements in the physiological function. But there's also a way to have an athlete also warm up, and this is passive. And this includes external sources like heating pads, whirlpools, or ultrasounds. So generally speaking, if you're an athlete and we can utilize some sort of warm-up technique, right, to kind of increase that temperature at the muscle. So if you've been injured, I'm sure you've had heating pads or been in a whirlpool or used ultrasound to kind of warm up that area. So by the time you start, actual practice or competition, that kind of helps physiologically improve the blood flow and help you to get back on the field. It is likely that optimal levels of a warm-up exist. These are related to the type of warm-up, such as a training warm-up or a competition warm-up, the tasks to be performed, the individual, the athlete, and the environment. So there's some sort of likely range of potentially effective warm-ups, but as a coach, you have to create a structured, well-designed program depending on the athlete's competition or training phase. The structure of general and specific warm-up, though valid, may need to be supplemented by an approach that allows for greater targeting of both short-term and long-term performance. One structure that has been adopted, though, by many coaches have addressed different key aspects of an effective warm-up is the RAMP protocol. Right? And this is referring to raise, activate, immobilize, and potentiate. Right? What this is that it's building upon the general and specific structure and provides a suitable approach which the performance can be maximized in the short-term, medium, and long-term performance for the athlete. As the name kind of indicates, raise, activate, and mobilize, and potentiate it has three different kind of key phases. When we look at the first phase, this is where the activities that raise the key physiological parameters, but also the levels of the skill of the athletes. So during this phase is analogous to the general warm-up and has the aim of elevating the blood flow and body temperature, the heart rate, the respiration rate, and joint fluid viscosity by providing some sort of low intensity activity. But a critical aspect is that unlike traditional general warm-up activities, these are not simply general aerobic exercise such as walking or cycling, but instead they attempt to stimulate the movement patterns of the upcoming activity or some way to develop the movement patterns or some sort of skill pattern that the athlete will need to deploy in this competition. In this way, the session from the outset is targeted at some sort of key movement and skill capacities, as also providing some sort of required physiological effect. By doing so, this also assists in the psychological preparation of the athlete for practice or competition, as the session constantly addresses components that relate to the performance. The next phase is activating and mobilizing, which is analogous to stretching component of a typical warm-up, such as the static stretching. But during this phase, the key movement patterns required for athletic performance in both the subsequent session and in the athlete's overall development, such as squat patterns, lunge patterns, are performed. So the focus on mobility or actively moving through a range of motion requires a combination of motor control, stability, and flexibility, and more closely relates to the movement requirements an athlete will face. The last phase is the potentiation phase, and this is analogous to the specific warm-up, but more importantly, it also focuses on the intensity of activities. This phase deploys sport-specific activities that progress in intensity until the athlete is performing at the intensity required for the subsequent competition or training session itself. This phase is very important to subsequent performance, especially in activities that require high levels of speed, strength, and power, yet is often omitted from traditional warm-ups. Flexibility is a component that is tied in with the athlete's warm-up period. With flexibility, this can increase or improve the range of motion within a joint, enhance performance, and also reduce the risk of injury prior to competition or activity. When we look at flexibility, though, this is a measure of range of motion and has static and dynamic components. Static flexibility is the range of possible movement about a joint and its surrounding muscles during a passive movement. With static flexibility, this requires no voluntary muscular activity. So an external force such as gravity, partner, or machine provides the force for a stretch. When we look at dynamic flexibility, though, this is referring to the available range of motion during active movements and therefore requires some sort of voluntary muscular action. The dynamic range of motion is generally greater than static range of motion. So one way in determining which type of flexibility is most crucial is how important it is for the nature of the sport itself for the athlete. A key role of flexibility is its contribution to an athlete's movement. So when we look at the flexibility, this is viewed just kind of in general, in isolation. This can be misleading as a normal range of motion does not guarantee normal movement. So that's why when we have to look at the athlete in the sport, we have to figure out what are the movements that the athlete is performing, looking at that range of the joints and everything in its range of motion, and tailoring the program or flexibility portion for the athlete so they can have increased performance in coordination. There are some factors that are affecting flexibility, such as joint structure, which is the structure that determines the joint's range of motion. So this is all predetermined based on the individual and can vary from individual to individual as well. So some individuals may have a joint structure in the shoulder that allows for optimal range of motion, while some individuals have a joint structure that is very tight, so their range of motion or flexibility at that specific joint, such as their shoulder, is very limited. Also, another factor affecting flexibility is age and sex. The older individuals tend to be a little bit less flexible than younger people, while females tend to be a little bit more flexible than males. Another component is muscle and connective tissue, where elasticity and plasticity of connective tissues also affect the range of motion. Another factor affecting flexibility is stretch tolerance. This is the ability of an athlete to tolerate the discomfort of stretching. Generally speaking, individuals or athletes with a greater range of motion tend to demonstrate a greater level of stretch tolerance and thus able to tolerate a greater stretch load. So one important feature for regular stretching during some sort of program is that it can increase an athlete's stretch tolerance and thus potentially permitting some further increase in flexibility for the athlete. Another factor is neural control. The control of an athlete's range of motion is kind of ultimately held at the level of the central and peripheral nervous system, just because that's one of the two major body systems of the human body. But this system includes both the afferent and efferent mechanisms, resulting in both the reflexive and conscious activities that ultimately kind of control the athlete's range of motion that they can attain. A key aspect, though, with kind of the neural control is that an effective flexibility program can have an increase in capacity by allowing for a greater range of motion for the athlete. A proper resistance training program may increase flexibility and also assist in the development of force capacity through enhanced range of motion. So a proper strength training program protocol should also be seen as an important adjunct to a stretching program. One thing, though, with resistance training is that heavy resistance training with limited range of motion during the exercise may decrease an individual's range of motion. So to kind of prevent the loss of range of motion, you should have athletes perform exercise that develop both agonist and antagonist muscles and should exercise through the full range of motion of the involved joints. One factor that you should consider, though, is individuals following injury that they aren't able to go through the full range of motion, but hopefully as time goes with resistance training and stretching as well, they'll be able to hit that. You often see this during individuals during the squat who just had an ACL injury. Even though they may have recovered by then, they can't, go the full range of motion for a squat. So you're just going to have to adjust and kind of incorporate, different warm-up strategies and stretching to hopefully get back to that range of motion. If not, you want to try to get that athlete to the closest the closest range or most effective range of motion that they had previously. Muscle bulk is another factor that is affecting flexibility. So generally speaking, individuals who have lots of muscles, such as bodybuilders or linemen, can have an adverse effect on range of motion by impeding joint and movement. So if you have an athlete that has large biceps and deltoids, they may experience some difficulty in stretching the tricep, racking a power clean, or holding a bar while performing a front squat. Generally speaking, when we look at muscle bulk, though, the reason why is that the muscles contact a lot sooner, but that's not always necessarily true though. You do see bodybuilders and offensive linemen who have, great flexibility in their joints. So kind of looking at the muscle bulk though, you may have to kind of alter the training program to kind of decrease the amount of muscle bulk, but this is all athlete dependent. So if you have an athlete who requires all the muscle, then it's not really advisable to change the program so they don't increase muscle size with that. So just always keep in mind the sport requirements where, an individual at a different position may not need as much muscle and can focus a little bit more on the flexibility. But with that, speaking with that the case, training and resistance training, for larger athletes or who need it, the muscle, bulk may need or supersede the athlete's range of motion that's needed. So again, always tailor it to the athlete itself. The last factor affecting flexibility is the activity level. So usually an active person tends to be more flexible than an inactive one, but activity alone will not improve flexibility in itself. Some key terms to know when it comes to kind of flexibility in relationship is viscoelastic. This is the muscle tendon unit which can extend immediately when stress is applied, and it continues to elongate with continued application. Elasticity is synopsis with stiffness. A muscle with a quick rise in tension during stretch will actually recover rapidly. So elasticity, if you have a decrease in elasticity, that stretch whenever it comes back or whenever you go back to original position, it won't rapidly recover. So elasticity can be seen in different portions, such as your muscles, and also you can have some elasticity properties within your lungs. So kind of as you get older, you have a decrease in elasticity, so your lungs don't kind of come back as quickly. So that's why you kind of see a decrease in VO2 max as you get older. When we think about flexibility, we often think about static flexibility. So this is what you are really kind of taught whenever you're at a very young age. When you're stretching, you just hold your position for, again, 10 to 30 seconds for a certain amount of sets, depending on how long you're holding it for. But with flexibility, though, there are different key terms to know. One is ankylosis, which is a pathological loss of range of motion, so a decrease in range of motion. Hypermobility is excessive range of motion, though. So depending on the individual and how their joint structure is, and some previous history, they may have some hypermobility where they have excessive range of motion. And also, if you had past injuries such as the knee during ACL, you might have ankylosis or loss of range of motion as well. So you want to kind of find like this, there's some sort of normal range within this kind of continuum with flexibility, but static flexibility is not whole body. It's usually just specific to joints and directions of movement. When we look at flexibility and injury risk, we see that athletes at both extremes of static flexibility may be at a higher risk for injury in itself. Remember, this extreme of flexibility is relating to ankylosis, so the pathological loss of range of motion, and hypermobility, the excessive incorporation of range of motion. But with flexibility and injury risk, this is a complex relationship that exists kind of with the static flexibility and the risk of muscular injury in itself. Generally speaking, when we kind of do a warm-up though, the increase in blood flow and increase in muscle temperature can kind of increase the resistance to a muscle tear. But when we look at flexibility though, this is all going to be referring to individuals on the range of motion of the sport itself. So if you have very inflexible muscles, or high flexibility in certain muscles in the the desired range of motion for that sport, right, it can appear or kind of equate to higher injury risk. So that's where you kind of have that normal range of on the figure here to the right on showing the flexibility, and if you kind of fall in that range, you might not see these higher injury rates for that. We often also see, and how we can kind of look at how flexibility comes into play in injury risk is that, female injuries, particularly the ACL, are a lot higher compared to males. Right? And this could be due to multiple reasons, but one of the theories with females increasing or having a higher risk rate at the ACL joint is during their menstrual cycle, and by doing so, this can increase the viscosity at the joint level, and then also increase the individual's flexibility at that joint, and by doing so, that can cause an ACL tear. Where males, since they don't have that menstrual cycle, they don't have that increase in viscosity at the joint itself, and that's why you don't see it as often when you kind of compare it to female athletes. When we look at flexibility or static flexibility of athletes or individuals, we can measure it directly or indirectly. A direct measurement is a measurement joint is looking at a joint range of motion in certain degrees. There are different measurement devices such as the goniometer, the electrogoniometer, the latent flexometer, and then inclometers, whether that's on a separate device or using your smartphone. Probably the most widely used measurement device on determining an individual's joint range of motion is the goniometer. And you can see that here in the figure to the right. In this case, this is going to have some sort of access point for the device, the goniometer itself. And what you're doing is, in this picture, the individual is placing the access point around the knee joint, and this individual is doing a knee flexion, and then whenever you're measuring it using this kind of protractor device, you can see the degrees and angle, or the degrees or the angle in which the individual or athlete has the range of motion with. And by doing so, you can write that down and use it as a baseline, and then based off your program, it can increase or hopefully not decrease during the program in itself. This is also very important to kind of utilize for individuals following injury. So you often get this measured at physical therapy. If you've injured yourself, they'll take the range of motion, and then during your physical therapy program, they'll kind of do like mid-test and then post-test to hopefully improve that range of motion and get it back to where it was normally for that. So there are certain ranges that are at certain joints where there's optimal or kind of a set pretense or kind of criteria for these flexibility measurements at certain joints. So you kind of really want to hit those joints just for overall health fitness. But with sports, remember that sports have specific ranges of motion. So when you're kind of measuring athletes, always kind of consider that on these different movement patterns that they're doing, and making sure that they're hitting those range of motions for the sport itself. When we look at the indirect ways to measure an individual's static flexibility, there are two probably more common ones. It's the sit and reach test and the back scratch test. When we look at the sit and reach test, this is often utilizing some sort of yardstick or box, but probably if you've been in the exercise physiology lab or just in general for PE, you are utilizing the box. Right? And this is having an individual place their feet against the box, and then having their hands overlap each other, and then exhaling and trying to push this lever you see over here to the right as far as they can. When it looks at the hamstrings, there's moderately related to hamstring flexibility, but for lower back, it's poorly related. So often, a lot of individuals will think that it's mainly looking at lower back flexibility, or a big component of this test is looking at lower back flexibility, but that's not really the case. It's mainly looking at hamstring flexibility as well. When we look at the back scratch test, this is looking at shoulder flexibility. So this is kind of having one arm kind of overhead, and then one arm kind of trying to reach the middle of the back. You often see some discrepancies between shoulders. Some individuals have really poor flexibility in the shoulders, and then you'll see that they can't even touch the tips of their middle fingers to each other. But essentially what you're doing for the back scratch test is you're measuring the distance between the one hand middle fingertip to the other hand's middle fingertip, and taking that distance. If you have a negative number, that indicates that you need some sort of improvement. If your fingertips are touching each other, then that's 0. You still need some improvement. And if they're overlapping, that's kind of a positive thing. So with that being said, some individuals, one shoulder is going to be a lot more flexible than the other. So if you look at this picture to the right here, we are testing the individual's right flexibility or right shoulder flexibility. So whatever arm is kind of the one kind of reached down, meaning the other hand, that's the shoulder flexibility that you're testing. When it comes to flexibility though, what is the frequency, duration, and intensity of stretching? So the acute effects of stretching on range of motion are kind of transient. So, but for longer lasting effects, a stretching program is required. So we need at least 2 sessions per week for at least a minimum of 5 weeks to kind of see some improvement. If you look at the ACSM guidelines, they kind of recommend 3 to 7 days per week, depending on the fitness goal, just because it's a health-related fitness component. But what you're doing is you're holding some sort of stretch at a position of mild discomfort for 10 to 30 seconds per stretch, right? And based off of that, you want a total time of 60 seconds. So if you're doing 10-second holds or 15-second holds, you're just going to be performing like 4 sets. If you're doing 30-second holds of static stretching, then you'll be performing 2 sets. When it comes to flexibility, an athlete should stretch following practice and competition. So the post-practice stretching facilitates a range of motion improvements because of the increase in muscle temperature. But when you have this time frame of following this practice or competition, it should be performed within 5 to 10 minutes. The increase in body temperature increases the elastic properties of collagen within the muscles and tendons, which allows for a greater stretch magnitude. This post-practice stretching may also decrease muscle soreness or DOMS, although the evidence on this is kind of ambiguous. Another time an athlete should stretch is during a separate session. So if the increased levels of flexibility are required, additional stretching sessions may be needed. So in this case, stretching should be preceded by a thorough general warm-up to allow for an increase in muscle temperature necessary for effective stretching. This type of session can be especially useful as a recovery session on the day after competition. There are 2 important proprioceptors that should be considered during stretching. One of them is muscle spindles. These are specialized intrafusal muscle fibers, which differ from normal muscle fibers. Normal muscle fibers are referred to as extrafusal, but the intrafusal muscle fibers are innervated by gamma motor neurons, where the extrafusal muscle fibers are innervated by alpha motor neurons. But muscle spindles provide some sort of mechanosensory information about changes in muscle fiber length and the rate of change in length. So we often kind of utilize muscle spindles or this proprioceptors through the stretch reflex. During a rapid stretching movement, a sensory neuron from the muscle spindle innervates a motor neuron in the spine. The motor neuron then causes a muscle action of the previously stretched extrafusal muscle fiber, which is referred to as the stretch reflex. When we think about the stretch reflex, probably the most common one that we can think of or we often refer to is the tendon knee tap that you get at the doctor's. But the stimulation of the muscle spindle and the subsequent activation of the stretch reflex should be avoided during stretching, just because as this motion will be limited by the reflective muscle action. So if the muscle spindles are not stimulated, the muscle relaxes, and then which allows for a greater stretch. Just because of this very slow movement during the static stretching, the stretch reflex is not invoked. But if you perform some sort of dynamic stretch or ballistic stretching movement, then we may be stimulating the muscle spindle and then therefore causing a stretch reflex. The second important proprioceptor is the Golgi tendon organ, or GTOs. This connects to the extrafusal fibers near the tendon's junction to the muscle. Also, this is able to detect differences in tension generated by the muscle. By doing so, this helps protect the muscle and the surrounding connective tissue, which harnesses from the injury or from the excessive load that is occurring. By doing so, the GTO responds as a feedback monitor to discharge impulses from tension created in the muscle when it shortens, and then also tension whenever the muscle stretches passively. When stimulated, the GTO causes the muscle to reflexively relax. Relaxation that occurs in the same muscle that is experiencing increased tension is called autogenic inhibition. This autogenic inhibition is accomplished via an action or some sort of active contraction of the muscle immediately before a passive stretch of that same muscle. So with this, tension builds up during the active contraction, which stimulates the GTO, which causes then a reflexive relaxation of the muscle during the subsequent passive stretch. So the relaxation that occurs in the muscle opposing the muscle experiencing the increased tension, this is referred to as reciprocal inhibition. This occurs when one simultaneously contracts the muscle opposing the muscle that is being passively stretched. So a good example on how GTOs play a role is during the tendon knee tap or the stretch reflex in its next counterpart or its counterpart. So whenever you have a tendon knee tap, when you go to the doctors, what happens is that you are causing some sort of passive stretch, all right, which are activating at the quadriceps, right, and this is causing to activate the gamma motor neurons, and by doing so, this is where that motor neuron is going to actively contract the quadricep. But then, since you are contracting the quadricep, the GTO is going to be stimulated, and this is going to cause some motor neurons and inhibitory neurons to kind of fire, and this is going to then cause that relaxation portion. So kind of overall, this is what the tendon knee tap kind of has a role when we're talking about your reflexes, right? And this is why proprioceptors are playing a role as well. When it comes to stretching, there are different types of stretching techniques. When we first look at static stretching, this is probably the most popular one and probably the first one you learn whenever you first started playing sports or started training. But this involves a slow increase in muscle group length and holding that position for a short time. Also, static stretching is very easy to learn and has been shown to effectively improve range of motion. So even though injury to muscles or connective tissue may result if the static stretch is too intense, there's really no disadvantage of utilizing this technique, just as long as proper technique is used. So static stretching is kind of appropriate for all athletes in a different variety of sports to increase their flexibility in itself. When we look at ballistic stretching, this typically involves active muscular effort and uses a bouncing type movement in which the end position is not held. So with ballistic stretching though, this is often used in the pre-exercise warm-up, but if you are not appropriately controlling or sequencing these movements, you may injure muscles or connective tissue, especially if you had a previous injury. So we don't want to incorporate this ballistic movement. It's not really ideal for the athlete, just because if they do have or a little bit more prone to injury, we can have that, and then that can leave them off the field, which isn't good for overall performance itself. The next type of stretching is proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. This uses a specific series of movements and contractions to use neuromuscular reflexes to relax the muscles being stretched. Part of this stretching was originally developed as a part of a neuromuscular rehabilitation program, which was designed to relax the muscles with increased tone or activity. And when we're talking about this increased tone or activity, this is often referred to relationship with the nervous system. But since then, transitioning from the rehab program, it's been adopted within athletics on ways to increase flexibility. So with this type of flexibility, you're often using some sort of partner, performing some sort of passive movement and active movement of the certain muscle groups, but people often kind of see this type of stretching kind of superior to other stretching methods because it facilitates muscular inhibition, which the evidence for this has been consistently shown with that. Next one is passive stretching. This uses an external force, usually another person, to stretch a muscle group in itself. So this is a little bit different compared to proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. All right, so you're just using some sort of force to get that extra stretch in. All right, you're not using specific movements or contracting and relaxing compared to PNF stretching. The last one is dynamic stretching. This is based on functionally based on stretching exercise that uses sports generic and sport specific movements to prepare the body for some sort of activity. And this is where you kind of get more towards the dynamic warm-up, which is very important for the athlete. Dynamic stretching, is often sometimes referred to as mobility drills. So this places, that emphasis on the movement requirement for the sport or activity, rather than just one, individual muscle group, kind of seen in static stretching. So when we further look into the different types of stretching, we'll look at static stretching, which is getting into a position that facilitates relaxation. So what we want is to have the athlete or individual move to a point in the range of motion where you experience some sort of sensation of mild discomfort. If you go beyond that, that's where you can kind of have the static stretching too intense and injury can occur. You'll utilize static stretching also within PNF stretching, but during this time, and this is occurring during like the relaxation portion of PNF stretching, but you want to communicate clearly with your partner during this time. So again, and to kind of reiterate, with static stretching that we've already went over, we want to hold these stretches for at least 10 to 30 seconds. And with our sets, this is going to range from 2 to 4 sets. And again, remember the total time for stretching is 60 seconds. So you can perform static stretching, bilaterally or unilaterally, but if you're performing a stretch unilaterally, make sure that you're hitting, each muscle group or each side evenly. When you're designing a dynamic stretching program, pretty much the starting point is to carefully analyze the major movement patterns within the given sport and the range of motion required within these movements for the athlete. So by doing so, you can select certain exercises that replicate those movements via these different dynamic stretches. One example to kind of look at for dynamic stretching is a walking knee lift, which walking knee lift that stretches and mimics the knee lift of a sprinter. You can do so by carrying out 5 to 10 repetitions for each movement, either in place or over a given distance. You can also perform other drills such as walking lunges and so forth. So there's different exercises to perform. There are some differences though compared to some other stretching techniques, such as the ballistic stretching. So when you think of the differences compared to ballistic stretching, is that dynamic stretching avoids bouncing and is performed in a more controlled manner than ballistic. So basically with this, the result is a controlled range of motion that is often smaller than that produced by ballistic stretching, but also demonstrates the control required to be able to actually move through the full range of motion of that joint and then assume and hold that position compared to ballistic. Another way dynamic stretching is different is comparing it to static stretching. So during this time, the muscle doesn't relax compared to static stretching, but instead is active through the range of motion. So this is a little bit more specific to the movement patterns of that actual sport. But even though it's an ideal warm-up activity, dynamic stretching may be less effective than static stretching or proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation stretching at increasing static stretching range of motion. But in situations in which an increased static range of motion is needed, static or appropriate or PNF stretching is also preferred. But generally speaking, we want to slowly increase the speed and intensity of motion when appropriate whenever we are carrying out these dynamic stretches. So again, the main goal of this stretch is to mirror the sport skill for these individuals, and by doing so, you are kind of always being incorporating some sort of coordination with technique and so forth. So by doing so, this is also going to help the individual, the athlete, develop that tempo and that mentality on prepping for training or competition. When it comes to PNF stretching, there are different techniques within this type of stretching. One is the hold and relax technique, and this begins with a passive pre-stretch that is held at the point of mild discomfort for about 10 seconds. Your partner then applies a hip flexion force and instructs you, the athlete, to hold and don't let them move the leg. So what you're doing is holding and resisting the movement so that an isometric muscle action occurs, and this is held for 6 seconds. Then what you're doing is relaxing, and a passive stretch is performed and held for about 30 seconds. The final stretch during this time should be of greater magnitude due to autogenic inhibition, on which we talked about earlier. An alternative technique within PNF stretching is the contract and relax technique. This begins with a passive pre-stretch of the hamstrings that is held at a point of mild discomfort for 10 seconds. The athlete then extends the hip against resistance from the partner so that a concentric muscle action through the full range of motion occurs. The athlete then relaxes, and then a passive hip flexion stretch is applied and held for 30 seconds. The increased range of motion is facilitated due to an autogenic inhibition on which we just talked about, and is very similar to the hold and relax technique. An alternative technique to this type of stretching is the athlete attempts to kind of extend the hip, and the partner does not allow the movement. So in essence, when we kind of compare the contract and relax method compared to the hold and relax, they are very similar, but in a way they are very different. Here are some common PNF stretches with a partner. You can perform PNF stretches for your calves and ankles, your chest, your groin. Mostly you'll kind of see PNF stretching with the hamstrings and hip extensors, but you can also do it with the quadriceps and hip flexors and your shoulders as well. Although static stretching enhances flexibility, which is recognized as a component of health-related fitness, it can also affect performance for the athlete. So with static stretching, there are some negative side effects, and this is usually occurring whenever static stretching is occurring pre-training or pre-competition. But some of the negative side effects seen with this static stretching is a decrease in force production, a decrease in power, a decrease in strength endurance, a decrease in reaction time, and a decrease in running speed. Also, ballistic and PNF type of stretching may also inhibit strength and power, and this is due to having both of these different techniques utilize passive movements, similar to static stretching. With this pre-event static stretching, that has a detrimental effects on the subsequent performance. And when we think about this is having an athlete or an individual you're training perform a static stretch and then immediately go into some sort of exercise or perform an exercise or go into competition. But this theory of decrease in performance is basically coming from this stretching induced effect because of this static stretch. And this is thought to be related to a decrease in neural activation, a reduced musculotendinous stiffness, or a combination of neural and muscular factors. So since static stretching can result in muscle damage, it is also possible that the tissue damage could explain somewhat of this stretching induced decrements in performance. And how we can kind of look at tissue damage is measuring it, looking at the creatine kinase in the blood. So whenever you have tissue damage or anything of that, creatine kinase is spilled out into the blood. Elevated is noting something bad, generally speaking. But how it affects the performance, this observed performance can have an effect that can last up to about 1 hour following static stretching within this time period. It should be noted that you shouldn't eliminate static stretching from an athlete's program, right? But the static stretching should occur during a cool down or a separate session. But with sports that require a high level of flexibility, may possibly benefit from a pre-event static stretching, such as gymnastics. But even those who are requiring a high level of flexibility for their sport, such as gymnastics, they still need to weigh out the pros and cons of that type of technique of stretching, where they may more benefit from a dynamic warm-up stretching compared to a static stretch. When it comes to pre-event static stretching, this has really been based on intuition and tradition before any scientific evidence and research was kind of conducted looking at the impact it had on performance. Nowadays, the dynamic warm-up has been becoming a lot more popular over this traditional pre-event static stretching. So, probably whenever you first started, working out as a young athlete, whatever sport that was, you did pre-event static stretching. But as you kind of, transition into high school and then, college now, you are probably starting to perform a lot more dynamic warm-ups, right? And with this is, emphasizing and stimulating movements that, occur for the sport, and emphasize that, and not just focusing on certain muscle groups such as the hamstring during the static stretch of touching your toes. But with the dynamic warm-up, we are, moving from movements of low intensity to kind of get the increase in body temperature and blood flow. And then we're going to slowly transition into moderate and then high intensity So by the end of the dynamic warm up and at the high intensity, we kind of have that, build up in tempo for the athlete. So whenever they reach the competition or start the competition, they can perform at their maximal performance. But also during the dynamic warm up, not only we are increasing the body temperature and increasing blood flow to the muscles, we're also enhancing motor unit excitability. So this is going to help us, increase our force production. We're developing kinesthetic awareness, so kind of knowing your surroundings, and then also maximizing the active range of motion. The thing with dynamic warm up is that some people also might refer this to as movement preparation for this type of training as well. So there's a lot of different names that can be thrown around with dynamic warm-up, such as movement preparation. I think we talked also a little bit earlier about mobilization kind of preparation as well. So again, when it comes to a dynamic warm-up, this does not consist of any bouncing type of movement, such as what you see in a ballistic type of stretching. This is more so controlled elongation of specific muscle groups. And with this, the continuous movement allows the muscles to stretch to a new range of motion and then contract to perform the desired action. And this is going to be enhancing the individual's performance whenever they go for the competition. So during this time, there's no relaxation of the muscles during this type of training. When we further look at how the dynamic warm-up affects performance, we can see that these high-intensity movements towards the end of the dynamic warm-up may optimize performance. So just to give you an example, if we have a sprinter, if we perform high steps, then a series of sprint drills, this is going to help maximize that individual's performance in the 100-meter dash or the 200-meter dash. Again, remember, we want a gradual progression of intensity. We just don't want to start out at a high intensity, but we want to start out low to increase that blood flow again, and then increase core temperature and so forth, and then eventually get to the high intensity. So what you will be doing as strength and conditioning professionals is really emphasize proper technique and mechanics to perform the movement correctly. So usually with, static stretching, all you're doing is just holding a position. There's not too much technique involved or the mechanics, but since you have these athletes performing, a continuous movement that's going to sort of mimic the individual's competition movement, then that really comes into play on, proper technique and mechanics. And hopefully by, working on the proper technique and mechanics during the warm-up, that's going to translate into better, outcomes during the competition. So also, say that your athlete isn't really too great in some of these movements, by incorporating in this, dynamic warm-up, they're gonna gain some practice. So over time, they'll improve their skills that way, and hopefully that will transition onto the field. But we think of this dynamic warm-up is very individualized to the athlete's needs and abilities. And then we can, see some improvement gains between 2 to 10% with that. So just remember, it's all athlete dependent. Just kind of like when you're looking at your athlete, testing and needs analysis and evaluation, we're all tailoring it to the athlete. So we're not always having, the same athlete perform the same type of exercise or any type of movement. So the goals are going to be different as well, but you might have some similar exercises such as like the lunge walk or knee lifts, but that's going to be a little bit different depending on the sport and then position as well. When you're developing an athlete's warm-up and flexibility type of program, you can also look into post-activation potentiation. And this is a phenomenon by which the force exerted by muscle is increased due to its previous contraction. And this is really looking at the preparation for explosive sporting events such as the high jump, the long jump, pole vaulting. If you're just mainly doing some sort of vertical jump, this is also part of the process. But you can incorporate this into the athlete's dynamic warm-up. And we'll talk a little bit more information about this post-activation potentiation whenever we get into the plyometrics section or topic. But this post, just to kind of give you a quick and brief information about this area, is that the post-activation potentiation may create an optimal environment for athletes and their performance by increasing the phosphorylation of the regulatory myosin light chains, also enhancing the neuromuscular function or possibly changing the pennation angle as well. But just some things to consider when you're looking at post-activation potentiation is that, for a brief time of repetitive stimulation, this can enhance the contractile response. So this is the potentiation. But if you have a continuous stimulation, it can impair contractile response and eventually lead to fatigue. So when you're doing certain exercises, which we'll talk later in the semester when we talk about plyometrics, you have to find this, finite area of performing enough to create this response so that the athlete is very explosive, but not so much where they'll be fatigued and have a decrease in performance. So given that the potentiation and fatigue can kind of coexist in skeletal muscle during repetitive stimulation and for some time afterward, you guys as strength and conditioning professionals must consider this interaction between these two variables when designing and implementing warm-up procedures for the athlete. So kind of in short, the net difference between potentiation and fatigue will determine the outcome of the pre-event protocol that you're designing. So some things to kind of consider as well is if we have too short of a recovery during this designing, we'll have fatigue with the athlete. But if we have too long of a recovery, the post-activation potentiation effect is lost. So when we think of the well-designed dynamic warm-up protocol, this can enhance the acute muscle performance in athletic populations, and this is due to in part of the effects of the activity-related post-activation potentiation that you're including in the athlete's warm-up. However, though, there are factors that need to be considered when applying, post-activation potentiation to athletic performance. And this is mainly going to look at training experience, the individual's power to strength ratio, the intensity and volume of the pre-event activity itself, and the recovery period, which can kind of influence the efficacy of kind of any performance enhancing stimulus. So when we think of our design and how we are implementing this to the athletes, we have to consider individual variability. So by this, we should consider looking at the application of this type of techniques of post-activation potentiation activities where they're requiring the dynamic muscular contractions. But we can, if we execute properly, then our athlete will have an increase in performance, and this is what we want. So when it comes to the issue regarding how we can, practically apply the post-activation potentiation is that timing, right? Like I mentioned, if it's too short of a recovery period, then the athletes can be fatigued. If it's too long, we're going to kind of lose that effect. But when we think of, this timing, there can be some sort of optimal time, which is probably going to exist when we have the muscle has recovered but is still potentiated, and this window is going to be kind of complex. It's going to depend on lots of factors, including the fiber type of the athlete, the training experience, the design of the preload activity, and so forth. But what we can, based off of current evidence, that this optimal time to maximize the post-activation potentiation effect on power performance, such as long jump or anything like that, is usually within about 4 to 12 minutes after this preload stimulus during the dynamic warm-up. So a thing to kind of note is that fatigue tends to be more dominant in the early phase of recovery, but it subsides at a faster rate than the post-activation potentiation. So this potentiation can be realized during the subsequent sport activity. Although we have this designed warm-up that increases the athlete's body temperature, enhances the athlete's flexibility, the incorporation of dynamic movement activities can also establish some sort of desired tempo for upcoming events and kind of set the tone for strength and conditioning activities or competition. So if we have a slow warm-up protocol and kind of monotonous, such as the general warm-up of slow jogging or slow cycling for 5 to 10 minutes, that's not going to kind of get the athlete mentally prepared Some individuals might like that. So again, remember, this is all going to be have to tailored to your athlete. But you know the performance during practice or the game that follows this kind of low intensity monotonous type of warm up, they're not going to see that enhanced performance. But if you have some sort of pre-event dynamic warm up, which is going to be engaging, it's usually diverse in the types of exercises, the performance during the practice or competition may be enhanced, just as we mentioned earlier, through the different mechanisms. So we need a warm up that includes dynamic flexibility to maybe help better focus the athlete's attention on listening, learning, and then noting task relevant cues. So again, since we are incorporating sport specific movements, that's really going to have the athlete kind of help learn the movements and have that awareness of where during the game or even during the warm up, if something's a little off, they'll kind of, feel that in a way. So, this is, I think very important and can often be overlooked on having, on when kind of designing a warm up for the athlete, is kind of the mental preparation. Unlike a traditional warm up where you have an athlete just exercise at a low to moderate intensity on a bike or jogging, followed by static stretching, a dynamic warm up can result in noticeable improvements in fundamental movement skills. Not only that, it also prepares the body or the athlete's body for vigorous, random movements that can occur during sports training and competition. So, with this phase of training, this can provide an opportunity for the younger athletes to gain confidence in their abilities to perform some sort of movement skill. Additionally, though, we can see that these warm-up activities that are, active, though more engaging and somewhat a little bit more challenging. So that's, helps the athlete make it, a little bit more enjoyable, which we talked about, rather than just stretching and holding that position for X amount of time for that. So when we are designing this dynamic warm-up for our athletes, we should always kind of turn on the neuromuscular system to prepare athletes for the demands of their sports. And how we do that, and the general idea is by having them warm up by performing sport-related movements, from again going from a low intensity to a high intensity. And this, by doing so, we are increasing body temperature, muscle temperature. Another way or ideas on how we are aiming to turn on the neuromuscular system is activating, so exciting or potentiating the neuromuscular system. And lastly, even though this is kind of mental, but motivate. So motivating is psychologically preparing the athletes for the actual demand for their training or for their competition for the sport itself. So this is going to help the athlete kind of maximize their performance, and that's what we want. When we look at this dynamic warm-up, a fundamental principle is performing large muscle group exercises that are similar to the patterns performed during competition. So what we want to have is having the individuals or athletes perform exercises between around 8 to 12, and with that they are following some sort of set number of repetitions or some sort of predetermined covered distance. So if you're doing a prescribed number of repetitions, this can be 10 repetitions, 15 repetitions. When we think about predetermined distance, this can be a very short distance such as 10 meters, or it can be up to 50 meters. It will all depend on your athlete. Again, when we are having this dynamic warm-up, not only do we have to go from a low intensity to high intensity, but we want to start very basic movements, and then as we progress and start increasing our body temperature for the athlete, we can start moving on to more complex movements and greater range of motion movements towards the end. Right? So this dynamic warm-up shouldn't be fatiguing for the athlete. It's just to get the blood flow and enhancing all these physiological abilities so they can perform optimally. Last thing to kind of incorporate if you are kind of looking at a timely, effective manner is combining some of the exercises for better efficiency. So to kind of give you an example, you can have the athlete perform knee lifts and then add in between each knee lift some sort of lunge walk. But this dynamic warm up should last about 10 to 15 minutes, where the general warm up is about 5 to 10 minutes. So that's some little differences between the two different types of warm ups. Individuals who have limited or no experience during this type of training that you're creating, you want them to kind of allow the appropriate time so they can become a little bit more familiar with this type of exercise and training. So we want to kind of utilize this, or introduce this type of training during the preseason for the athletes, or a little bit earlier. And by doing so, we're limiting any potential muscle soreness that can result from performing some sort of novel dynamic movement during this warm-up activity. So additional ideas for incorporating dynamic flexibility exercises in the warm-up protocols you can kind of utilize from other coaches whenever you go to conferences, reading research articles as well, seeing what which is possibly the best kind of protocol for a certain sport. So there are different opportunities to have that for you as a resource. In summary, active participation in a well-designed dynamic warm-up can prepare athletes both physically and mentally for the demands of sports training and competition. Also, despite the conventional wisdom that favors pre-event static stretching, there's a growing body of evidence that indicates that incorporating dynamic movements into a warm-up protocol may improve performance during sports training and competition by increasing the individual's body temperature, enhancing ranges of motion, and improving the neuromuscular function. Also, additional research is needed to optimize this warm-up procedure for athletes and to better understand the influence of this dynamic warm-up protocols on sports-related injury risk as well. But generally speaking, a well-conceived dynamic warm-up activity can have a favorable influence on athletic performance. So lastly, a warm-up should be carefully planned and thought out to the same degree as the main exercise session or competition for the athlete.